haven't been noticing anybody sleeping, so that's good. I must be interesting to you a little bit anyway. Before I forget, be sure to sign up for our mailing list back there if you have not done so. In fact, I had a bunch of DVDs that were free on the free side, but you're actually only supposed to take them if you if you give me your name on the mailing list. And I noticed all the DVDs were gone and no names were on the mailing list last night. So, and I'll tell you the story behind that. If you haven't gone up to Kentucky and seen the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter, I highly recommend it. It is a powerful experience. In fact, but you know, of course, the unfortunate thing is they're going to have denominational doctrine laced in there here and there. At the end of the Creation Museum, you see it. You can pretty much bypass that. The rest of it, for the most part, is right on target, and it's just done in a masterful way. I mean, it cost them $40 million to do the Creation Museum, $100 million to do the Ark Encounter, and it was, you know, it's spectacular. They have tens of thousands of people go through there every year, and they hear their standard dogma and all that. So I thought, man, it would be really cool if there was a Brotherhood version of that. So I went up there and sat down with their money guy at the Creation Museum that was kind of the right-hand man of Ken Ham, and who's the CEO up there at Answers in Genesis. And I said, man, how did you guys raise $40 million? What's going on with that? Of course, one of their things is they're cross-denominational. Our audience is primarily Churches of Christ. They've got all kinds of people. But he said that they had a few people that stepped up and gave $1 million. But for the most part, it was having an enormous mailing list. And he said, what you need to do is you offer something free to people if they'll sign your mailing list, and that'll help you out. And so I was like, all right, well, we developed a little, actually, it's a DVD of this session I'm about to do. Unfortunately, when I go around, I find everybody's taking the DVD and still not signed the mailing list. So let's be sure to sign the mailing list. That'll help us out a lot. The good thing is it'll make it where if we have a major product we need some help on, especially financially, we can let you know about that. For example, right now we're working on an Apologetics study Bible. You think that'd be a great thing to have? Or is basically along the bottom of the Bible, throughout the whole Bible, you've got our stuff on apologetics laced throughout the whole thing. Well, that's a monumental undertaking, and something everybody needs to be aware of in case you're willing to assist us with that financially or in some other way. So sign our mailing list if you would. In this session, I want to give some of the positive evidences that support not just a God, but specifically the God of the Bible. AP has been in the business of defending New Testament Christianity for over 35 years now, if you can believe that. And as I'm sure you're aware, we're involved in many areas of apologetics, the existence of God, and evolution, creation, evolution, of course, but also inspiration and integrity of the Bible, defending the deity of Christ, modern apologetics issues like homosexuality and abortion, the silencing of God in America, many things like that. But of course, the hallmark subject that we've spent a lot of time addressing over the years, especially in the realm of science, is evolutionary theory. And so we've really, I feel like, dealt a death blow to Darwinian evolution, showed that it's not supported by the evidence. They haven't been able to refute that. Our arguments are still standing solid. They can't deal with it. Evolution contradicts the evidence on many accounts. We've done the same thing with the Big Bang Theory. And as we continue to stay on top of these topics, as new things are brought to the table, we continue to develop materials to respond to those. And we feel like we need to keep doing that because these are issues that are chipping away at Christendom's faith in the Bible in a widespread way. It's playing a major role in that 20% of the church that's leaving due to science-related things. We've got a mass exodus going on. So we as Christians examine the evidence, we counter evolutionary theory. Now, what happens in this day and age when we've done our job and evolution has been dealt with? It's been defeated in a person's mind. What are they left with? Well, a few decades ago, Americans were by and large Christian in their orientation and their thinking. And so when evolutionary theory really started gaining ground in America and Christian evidence organizations refuted the specific arguments that were being made by evolutionists, it was natural for people to just fall back on their faith in Scripture. But now that's not really the case anymore. Pluralism and tolerance and acceptance of diverse religious beliefs has been shoved down our throats now for decades. And so now when evolutionary theory is refuted in the minds of this next generation, it's not so easy to convince them which origin model is the true one, even if they concede a God of some sort. Because you've really got a lot of options out there in our country now. So it's not so easy to convince people that the biblical model is the true creation model out of the many. Where's the scientific evidence for that, they say. We at least have something to work with, unlike you creationists, you biblical creationists. You guys don't even have any evidence. You have a blind faith in the flood and in creation. I actually have an entire seminar dealing with that subject, dismantling or laying out the positive case for creation. And this is going to be a taste of that tonight. So as I mentioned at the beginning of our sessions Friday night, statistics indicate we're losing 4 out of 10 of our young people when they leave home. Half of those are becoming irreligious, and in many cases that's due to science-related matters. So we're talking questions about evolution and biblical creation. And many don't believe that there is evidence for biblical creation. And others say it doesn't matter anyway. You should just blindly believe in creation regardless of the evidence. And I responded to that idea last night as well. Blind faith is not a biblical concept. It's irrational, and it's causing many people to leave Christianity because they've been led to believe that Christianity is without evidence and that it doesn't have to even have evidence. And so if you're a rational person, you're not going to like that. You can't stomach that. So if I want to be able to win the hearts and minds of people in this scientific age, we have to be able to fill this void that we leave after we counter evolution. You leave a void, you see. You haven't actually taught the true model. You've just eliminated the current model. You have to now fill this void with a model that harmonizes with the evidence. We have to fill that void with the true model of our origins before other false models fill in that gap. You know, nature abhors a vacuum. They're going to fill that void with something. We need to make sure that it's the true model. So notice, refuting error becomes pointless if we don't provide and teach evidence of the true model. So enter modern creation science. Question: where do we go to get answers when we have scientific challenges that are levied against the biblical flood model or the creation model? Okay, we're supposed to be ready to give a defense with evidence, so where do we turn? Well, we probably typically turn to Christian evidences organizations that we hope will have answers to the challenges that are being made, okay? Who are they turning to for answers that are backed by actual scientific data and field work? You know, there are specific questions that are being asked that are requiring field work. There are what I would describe as a handful of young earth creation scientists that we're all counting on to step up and try to fill the gap in this area. And so they're the ones that are getting into the field, getting dirty, doing the science. They're gathering the evidence that supports the biblical model in the field. Your geologists, your paleontologists, your biologists, your cosmologists, meteorologists, physicists, engineers, and they're studying the text of the Bible to extract as many clues as they can, for example, about the flood, you know, what the Bible said happened in the flood, and about our origins, and then they're using modern scientific knowledge to do research and testing to develop a robust scientific model that explains the evidence in the universe from a biblical perspective. So we at AP have quoted from these scientists many times in defense of the biblical model. We've referred to their work to defend Scripture, but there's not enough of them to do what needs to be done. Notice we can speculate and theorize all day to try to explain the physical evidence in light of Scripture. We can claim, okay, the Grand Canyon was carved by the flood, or that a bunch of the water from the flood it froze to capture the woolly mammoths, or claim that the water from the flood came from a water bubble above the earth that popped during the flood. Okay, but guess what? Naturalists can do the same thing with their speculating and theorizing, right? So they also can make theories to try to explain the physical evidence in light of naturalism. So how do we refute their arguments and substantiate our own? Actual hands-on fieldwork, gathering proof, physical evidence that supports our theories. And there are a few creation scientists doing that kind of work, but several of the leading scientists, frankly, are getting old. They're about to be retiring. And so the field scientists are short-handed. So what does that mean? Well, that obviously affects how much work can be done. It affects how much peer review can be done of that work, and that's important because you don't want to rely on the work or opinion of just one individual when trying to go to battle against skeptics or looking for flaws in your work. And the fact that they're short-handed also affects how quickly things can get done in developing the creation model. And another problem we're encountering is that these guys, the leaders, are denominational. The leaders in creation science fieldwork are denominational. As far as I've been able to find, very, very few professional scientists that are members of the church can claim to be doing first-hand scientific research, specifically in creationism. Okay, so we're having to count on the fieldwork of these denominational guys. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that we don't have people studying what's being done. We do that at AP, and others are doing that too. That's important. But notice historically, that's not really been what AP has been about, getting into the field. And so let's face it, the Brotherhood, by and large, hasn't been out there actually gathering data in the field, specifically trying to help build the creation model. So when Bill Nye challenged creationists to explain what he claimed were hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering in the ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica that proves the Earth has to be hundreds of thousands of years old, we relied on the work of denominational creation scientists that have studied that matter firsthand, meteorologists. When Big Bang theorists challenged creationists to explain how starlight from stars that are billions of light years away could already be here in only a few thousand years, we rely on denominational creation astronomers, astrophysicists, and cosmologists to give an answer to that. When they challenge us to explain how the cosmic microwave background radiation in space can be explained under any other model besides the Big Bang, we lean on the expertise of denominational scientists who do that kind of field work and study, cosmologists. So when geologists challenge creationists to explain the origin of the Grand Canyon from a young Earth perspective, we're relying on the work of creation geologists to give an answer, and again, they're by and large denominational scientists. All right, so you see a problem here? It's not as though we don't have many professional, excellent scientists in the Brotherhood. That's not the issue. It's that their jobs don't generally allow them the time and the money to be able to do this kind of research, to respond to these things. They're typically busy doing secular work, or they're teaching at our universities, where we don't have creation research centers like some of the denominational schools do. Some of the denominational schools have centers for this kind of work and funding. So creation research centers that would allow our scientists the time, the funding, and the students to do creation research. This is something that I've been working on for the last 5 years now, because I think this is something AP needs to be able to do, and I need to raise the money for that. So what are we doing about this problem in the Brotherhood, though? As far as I can tell, essentially nothing has been done. And we're leaving this work, this field work, up to others. And we're counting on them to do it. We're counting on them to fund it, and we just sit back and we wait. And in many cases, we're counting on these denominational scientists to interpret that data for us, when the evidence that they're gathering is out of our field of expertise and above our pay grade, so to speak. And the problem with that is that sometimes they interpret things in a different way than we would, because they have a different understanding of the Bible than we have. And yet, we're relying on them. Do you see a problem here? Again, when you keep in mind 85% of our young people are in the public school being taught naturalism, they're leaving the church in droves over this stuff. You see, this is a major problem. This is something we got to address. This is only going to get bigger and bigger, this problem, as science progresses and as naturalism becomes more and more ingrained in our society. And as more and more of the conservative, the old school, young earth denominational scientists start dying out. See, because even in the denominational world, they're becoming less and less friendly to the young earth perspective too. So we're finding fewer and fewer professional scientists that even accept the biblical model of the age of the earth. It's not even being taught in the denominational world. So you see the problem here? Christians need to be ready to stand toe-to-toe with secular scientists in developing and defending the true creation model. I think it's clear that God wants us to be able to do that. He expects us to be able to study the works of the Lord, the great works of the Lord, Psalm 111 and verse 2. We need to tell others about God's marvelous works. Remember Psalm 19:1, like the heavens that declare the glory of God. That's something that we need to be able to study. We need to study the things that are made, that proclaim the existence and attributes of God. Evidence is so clear that to reject them is without excuse. We need to be able to defend the biblical model with solid science, being always ready to give a defense, 1 Peter 3:15. So, with all of those things in mind, over the last few years, AP has been trying to do something about this problem. And I've specifically been representing AP in the field with frontline scientists in the creation movement. Again, these denominational guys that are studying geology and paleontology, meteorology, and so forth, and seeing what's going on in the field with these creation scientists who are studying the created order in order to try to find evidences for the biblical model. So for the rest of this session, I want to fill you in on some of the things that are going on that I'm learning about in my travels. In 2014 and 2016, I had the opportunity to participate in 2 geologic field expeditions for several days, traveling up to eastern Wyoming with Dr. Kurt Wise to study the Lance Formation. Wise is a young earth creation geologist and paleontologist, got his PhD from Harvard under the advisement of the late Stephen Jay Gould, but again, he's denominational. Stephen Jay Gould was a famous evolutionist who we've quoted many times over the years. In fact, I quoted him last night, I believe, to you. The Lance Formation, where we're studying, is several layers of rock in the geologic column that many creationists believe are the last layers that are laid down in the flood. Although there's considerable debate among creationists over that issue. The formation is found at the top of what we call the Cretaceous system in the geologic column. This is just under what's called the KT boundary or the KPG boundary. This is where the Cretaceous system, you probably heard that word Cretaceous associated with dinosaurs. It's where the Cretaceous system meets the Tertiary. Now that is the location of a mysterious extinction event that secular geologists believe happened 65 million years ago and wiped out all the land dinosaurs and about 75% of all the other plant and animal species on the planet. Now, of course, creation scientists interpret it differently. We believe the Lance Formation, again, to be the last formation laid down at the end of the flood a few thousand years ago. Many, many dinosaur fossils have been found in the Lance Formation, especially in the Lance Creek area where this expedition took place. You've got your Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, and Tyrannosaurus. They're typical there. I'll talk about that more later. The most exciting evidences for the flood that we found were these special layers in the Lance Formation that are called seismites. And there are quite a few of these layers, in fact, more than 25. And from what I can tell, the concept of a seismite is a relatively new idea. Geologists haven't been even noticing their existence for all that long. Seismites form when you have an earthquake that vibrates a layer of wet sediment, like sand. And so you picture, maybe you go onto the seashore and some of that soggy sand there that's under the water along a shoreline. When an earthquake happens, it shakes that soggy sand, and the water within its particles tries to escape from the sand, moving upwards, and the sand will settle down. And so the water moves up out of those, out of the sand, and so what you end up finding is, if that sand dries out after the earthquake and then lithifies, it turns to stone. Okay, and then you were to cut that sandstone in two and look at the inside layers, you'll see these little squiggly lines, convolutions that form where the water has tried to get out as the sand is shaken. And these are called fluid avulsion structures. And so when you see a major earthquake today, like the one in Alaska in 1964, 8.2 magnitude earthquake, huge, it'll create a seismite when you've got wet sediment like sand. Now that Alaskan earthquake made a seismite that was about 11 inches. And that's typical when geologists study seismites from major earthquakes today. You find a few centimeters or inches thick for magnitude 9 earthquakes. All right, so big earthquakes forming these seismites about that big. Now, if the flood happened, we would expect there to be seismites in the flood layers. because they form when you have wet sediment and when you have earthquakes. And we would predict in the flood that you're going to have both of those. You've got the fountains, all the fountains of the great deep are broken up, the text says. And so you've got major tectonic activity going on. So the modern flood model that's popular today among the young earth creationists involves plate tectonic theory, but a catastrophic form of it called catastrophic plate tectonics. I don't have time to get into that now. Again, I discussed that in that seminar, but suffice it to say it's supported by a lot of evidence, and it predicts that many of today's mountains were formed rapidly during the flood when the Earth's plates were smashing into each other on the order of meters per second. Now, if that's true, we would predict seismites to exist in flood sediment, and in fact, a lot of them. Well, that's exactly what we're finding in the Lance Formation, but there's a catch. The seismites we find in Wyoming aren't just centimeters or inches thick, like 9.0 magnitude earthquakes. They're several meters thick. They are so huge that there is no modern reference point to understand the magnitude of the earthquakes that cause these things. Now, this means that, number one, the whole area was once covered with a lot of water, enough to make several meters of soggy sand. Number two, several major earthquakes happened. We found 7 distinct seismites in 2014, and then since then we found a bunch more. There's over 25 of these. And so these seismites could have only been formed from earthquakes that are so huge that no human has ever experienced them. Except for Noah and his family, they're probably still up floating on the ark at this point, don't even notice it's going on. This is proof of catastrophic activity like no other, that you would expect exactly to be the case if the flood happened, rather than uniformitarianism would predict. So notice how big these are. This is me standing here. Look at how huge these seismites are. We're talking earth-shattering earthquakes. We're talking continents are smashing into each other, sending shock waves through entire continents, causing these to happen. Well, how in the world is the evolutionist going to respond to this? Well, recall the KT boundary, which crosses the area that we're working in here. That's the line where there are no known dinosaur fossils above that line. Okay, when you get to this point, that's why they think they went extinct there, because you don't find any more fossils after that. You find archaeological evidence, which we talk about in our literature, but not the fossils. And so secular scientists believe the dinosaurs died out by something that happened at that boundary. Now, one theory that's gained a lot of ground among the secular geologists is that a meteorite impact caused this extinction, because you find a massive crater it's been discovered off the coast of Mexico that appears to line up precisely with the KT boundary. It's called the Chicxulub crater, and this is a representation of that meteorite. This is a secular portrayal. We would say that when this meteorite hit, it was likely towards the end of the flood. The earth still has a lot of water on it that hasn't receded yet, so this wouldn't really be a good depiction. Anyway, they would point to a seismite as proof of the shock wave from the impact of this meteorite. Okay, so we have to dig into that. Does that hold up to the actual physical evidence? Well, we find no, it doesn't fit the evidence there at the Lance Formation. Number one, it doesn't explain why the entire area, literally thousands of miles away from the crater they found, the Chicxulub crater, why that area would have been covered with water, enough water to saturate meters upon meters of sediment, hundreds of feet. Now, we could explain that under the flood model. They can't explain that. Number two, if the dinosaurs were in the relative area there in Wyoming, which we would expect since they're buried there, I mean, I've seen the dinosaur graveyards there, then either they were all living in that water-saturated area, and therefore apparently they're not land animals, they're water animals, which goes against the modern definition of a dinosaur, or that area wasn't usually under all of that water, and whatever killed them involved unusually high amounts of water, which again wouldn't make sense if you're just talking about a meteorite that far away. Now, if you're closer to the meteorite, you'd certainly get hit by a tidal wave if that meteorite hit the water, but not if you're this far away. So geologists estimate that the southeastern states of the U.S. would have been affected by the tsunami that would have been caused by this impact. So they say Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, but not the Northwest where we're working. Number three, the size of even 3-foot seismites would be termed unearthly by the secular community much less 3-meter seismites. In other words, there is no known earthly mechanism that can explain these. They're unearthly. And so they postulate something extraterrestrial had to happen, like a meteorite. Now the problem is that we're finding seismites essentially every 80 vertical feet throughout the lance formation. And the prediction is there's going to be dozens of these, not even just the few that we found. So while there is the Chicxulub crater at the KT boundary, and sure there is a seismite that lines up there, what about all of the other seismites above and below that line? Okay, so now are we arguing that multiple meteorites hit in a cyclical way? Well, that doesn't work because there's no evidence of enormous craters corresponding to those specific other seismites. And number two, the seismites appear to be virtually cyclical. So they're spread out at regular intervals, which would imply that these meteorites would have had to strike in a cyclical, regular way, and there's no evidence that that happens. Okay, so someone says, well, maybe it was just one massive event that caused all the seismites at one time. Well, that's a problem because number one, seismites form in wet sediment, so you got hundreds of vertical feet of sediment would already have to be wet for them to form in that. That's going to be a problem, not for the biblical model. Number two, it would require an impact that would be so large, none of them would want to say it, that it could happen because it would break the earth apart. It would be so huge. Number three, there are layers of sandstone between the seismites which aren't seismites. And so if you've got one major event, that should have formed seismites in those other places as well. So we deduce that the evidence points to multiple earthly events, not extraterrestrial in origin. So bottom line, while the meteorites, I think, clearly played a role during the flood. In fact, I've recently been studying that. Of the few dozen known meteorite craters in the world, including the one down the road I got to go check out today, most of them hit during the flood, interestingly, including the one that you've got close by here, and then shortly after the flood. Interesting, I'm finding that meteorite impacts were a major part of the flood. Fascinating study that I'm doing on that. So the explanation that fits best with the evidence is a global flood, where you've got fountains of the great deep breaking up, causing enormous earthquakes, and therefore forming these seismites. So such a theory helps explain the evidence. Now notice, this is the kind of field work that has to be done to try to build the creation model. And AP is starting to get in the mix on this. And again, we appreciate your prayers on this, and especially your financial assistance on it. I've got young people that I've brought through our intern program that are now at Freed-Hardeman and even moving on to graduate school that are hoping to come and do this kind of research for us. I got to raise a salary for them. We don't have it. So we'd appreciate your prayers and your assistance in that. And back in 2015, I was able to go on 2 creation field trips and was able to bring along one of our summer interns, Noah Eisenhower, to help out. We were able to travel into the Grand Canyon for several days by raft with the leading creation Grand Canyon geologist, Dr. Stephen Austin. Secular critics call him the Dean of Grand Canyon Studies among the creationists. So we went with him to study the Grand Canyon and learn about the evidences of the flood and how the Grand Canyon could have been formed from a young Earth perspective. The Grand Canyon is perhaps the most often used evidence of an old Earth. Secular geologists are notorious for using the Grand Canyon to try to prove that the Bible is wrong. And so they'll look, for example, at how long it takes sand particles to build up on desert sand dunes today. And they compare that deposition process to the sandstone layers that you find in the Grand Canyon, and they determine that based on sand deposition rates today and the thickness of those sandstone layers in the Grand Canyon, it must have taken millions of years for those Grand Canyon layers to form. All right, and they add to that assumption that in between each of these sediment layers, there were long periods of time where there wasn't much buildup of sediment. You've just got erosion by rivers and wind and lakes and so forth. So we were able to go into the actual Grand Canyon and study firsthand to see evidence that refutes those ideas. These are things that you can't do without actually getting out there and getting your hands dirty. You can speculate a response, but that's not evidence. You got to get out there and figure out, is that true? All right, so in the geologic column, there's this distinct line that is lower in the strata that you can't usually see in the normal terrain that we live on. And so this is a line that sits right above what we call the Precambrian strata, and it's dated as being at over 500 million years old, of course using the old Earth dating techniques, which is another subject. In the Grand Canyon, those Precambrian strata are tilted up as though they were lifted up. And then all of a sudden, they're cut off horizontally by this erosion surface that extends throughout the Grand Canyon and even across the whole Earth. And then starting at that line, as you move up, boom, you've got this sudden explosion of fossils in those layers. They're already fully formed without any evolutionary history. It's called the Precambrian explosion. It's where life really just boom. It's like, here it is. And so this explosion of life preserved as fossils that appears at the base of the Cambrian strata. So this is where they start coming about here. Underneath that, you've only got little bits of life here and there that can hardly be even called life. So I had the opportunity to go see this line and trace this line out to different places. When I was in Colorado in 2014 at the Garden of the Gods, this line is known as the Great Unconformity, and again, it stretches across the planet, this erosion surface. And of course, you see it at the Grand Canyon whenever you get down deep there by raft. So clearly something significant happened at that point in history that affected the entire Earth. Well, that line represents what creation geologists overwhelmingly believe to be the beginning of the biblical flood. And here's some of the evidences in the Grand Canyon that we were able to study to highlight that. You might remember from earth science class back in middle school that there's different kinds of rock on the earth, metamorphic and igneous and sedimentary rocks are formed by water. And so we can make a prediction about the Grand Canyon that would support our contention about the flood if this prediction bears out. The layers above the Great Unconformity in the Great Canyon should be sedimentary, except in whatever places where you might have lava coming up from beneath the Great Unconformity that forms igneous rocks. Otherwise, it should be sedimentary rocks, because this is all flood layers. So these are sediments that are laid down during the flood. Well, sure enough, the layers above the Great Unconformity in the Grand Canyon are all made of sedimentary rock, exactly as we'd predict. So secular geologists counter by saying, well, sedimentary rocks can also form from wind, like would be expected in a desert-like environment, which they predict is the actual origin of some of those sandstone layers in the Grand Canyon. And hey, the Grand Canyon's out there in a desert. It fits. Okay, so we'd make another prediction about those rocks in the canyon. We'd predict that if a flood covered the earth and formed these layers in the Grand Canyon, you should find fossilized aquatic creatures that would have come up from the oceans that would have been dumped onto the land. They should be caught in these layers. Now that obviously wouldn't make sense in a desert environment if that's what created these layers of the Grand Canyon. Well, sure enough, marine shell fossils from ocean creatures are found throughout the Grand Canyon, like the famous nautiloid beds. Sponges are found. And another evidence, we've got fossilized animal footprints on the canyon sandstone layers. So were they made in a desert environment from creatures that are walking on dry sand, or are they on underwater sand? Well, scientists have studied these footprints and compared them to footprints that are made by creatures on dry sand versus underwater sand, and they found there's no doubt these footprints had to have been made by creatures that were underwater when they made these tracks, not in a desert. Notice again, we're talking field work. You got to actually do testing to compare the footprints with actual physical data. Okay, scientists also studied the difference between sand dunes that form slowly from wind being deposited in the desert, and similar sand dunes that are called sand waves that are made rapidly in the ocean by water that transports sand. The angle of the sand layers within the sandstone in the Grand Canyon, which are about 25 degrees, doesn't match the angles of desert dunes formed by wind, which are consistently above 25 degrees, as much as 30 to 34 degrees. So instead, they match the typical angle of ocean sand waves, giving more evidence that the canyon layers were actually formed underwater. So other scientists have determined that if a sand wave is made under deeper water, the sand wave is going to be taller than one that's made under shallower water. Well, the Grand Canyon has sand waves that are about 30 to 60 feet high, meaning that the water depth that formed these must have been 150 to 300 feet in depth. Okay, now scientists also come about and they determine from those numbers that the water that formed the sand waves of the Grand Canyon must have been traveling at 3 to 5 feet per second. So extremely high speed. Again, this is all exactly what we predict to be the case during the flood. Only a catastrophic event like a tsunami can create the situation that we're seeing in the formation of these sediment layers there at the Grand Canyon, and it lines up perfectly with the flood. So the evidence shows that the layers of the Grand Canyon are formed rapidly in the flood. But could there have been a lot of time that passed between each of these cake layers, as evolutionary geologists argue? So imagine making a cake. So if you made one layer and then you put some icing on there, and then you immediately make another layer and put it on top of the first, the two layers would connect to each other smoothly, okay? But if you were to then, let's say you open up the kitchen window and you put the cake out there on the windowsill to cool before it hardened, and then you accidentally left it there. It's open to the air for a few weeks, maybe you go out of town. Okay, what would happen to the cake? You come back and you decide, okay, I'm going to go ahead and finish this cake and I'm going to add more layers to it. I don't recommend that. But what is the second layer now going to look like? Okay, well, some of it may have molded or disintegrated from decaying. Some of it may have been eaten by insects. If it rained a lot and got the cake wet, there may even be little riverbeds in the cake where the water ran off of it. Okay, so then if you went ahead and made another layer and put it on top of that second layer, and you looked at the side of the cake, and you look at the profile of this cake, you'd notice that the line between that second layer and the third wasn't smooth. You've got dips and evidence of erosion and holes. You see where we're going with this? At the Grand Canyon, you can look at the lines between all of these layers, and you can assess whether there's evidence of any time passing between them. And what we find is that in a widespread way throughout the Grand Canyon, there is no solid evidence that there's long periods of time passing between the layers. For many of the layers, we find plenty of evidence that there isn't any appreciable time between these layers. They form rapidly because you see that the connection between the layers is very smooth. In some places, sporadically, there's evidence that there is some time between the layers, but not necessarily evidence of long time. So the evidence, the erosion that shows that there is any time in between the layers can be explained as having happened quickly, possibly before those lower eroded layers were lithified, kind of like what you would expect if it rained on the cake while it was still a little bit mushy. So the evidence of time between various layers likely reveals brief periods of time that would have elapsed due to the fall and rise of the tide and so forth, how the moon was affecting the surges and waves of the flood, as well as the effects of periodic enormous tsunamis that would have been occurring due to the catastrophic geologic activity going on at the base of the ocean during the flood. So bottom line, lots of evidence that the Grand Canyon layers formed quickly in the flood. Okay, so how do we explain the Grand Canyon? Now again, it's typical, we just say, well, the flood. And we think that sums it up. That's really not a very accurate, you're going to get burned if you try to say that and you're dealing with a naturalist. Modern creation geologists explain how the strata of the Grand Canyon formed rapidly in the flood, but the carving has to come about later. So here's the thinking. Secular geologists today explain that the floor of the Pacific Ocean, so the oceanic plate there, is slowly diving, it's subducting beneath the west coast of the United States, which is its own continental plate. And so it's moving, this plate is going under the continental plate, moving down into the mantle. And as it does that, volcanoes and mountains are forming. And we don't have a problem with that idea, but there is a difference between creationists and secular geologists on this process. Creation scientists today believe that in the flood, this movement occurred at much faster rates than it does today, on the order of meters per second, as compared to today's rates of centimeters per year. And so that process would have caused large amounts of wet material, sediment, to rapidly pile up on the west coast, and areas of the west coast would have been uplifted as the ocean floors dove under and pushed up against the continent. Okay, so one area that was likely raised at that time was a huge saucer-shaped area of land that we today call the Colorado Plateau. You got portions of this that spans 4 states, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. The plateau is surrounded by mountains, including the Rockies and the Kaibab Upwarp, forming a saucer. And so wet sediment that is sliding from these 2 places, the plateau and the ocean sediment from the coast, were probably responsible for some of the layers that you see in the Grand Canyon. Although some of the canyon layers have sediment, the geologists have traced down to sources that are hundreds of miles away. So this is proof that a major catastrophic event was needed to transport that sediment all the way over here to the Grand Canyon and dump it. Now, after those layers are formed, something has to carve through them. And so many secular geologists believe that the Colorado River is the culprit, and they say, hey, it carved it very slowly over 70 million years. But years ago, before Glen Canyon Dam was built that controls the movement of the Colorado River through the canyon, engineers found that the river was carrying 168 million tons of sediment out of the Grand Canyon every year, eroding that away. All right, now if the Colorado was carving the canyon over 70 million years, 1.3 million cubic miles of sediment should have been carried to the delta at the end of this river and dumped. That is a volume 1,500 times the volume of the whole Grand Canyon. Now, it shouldn't be difficult to find an enormous amount of material like that if that's what happened. But that sediment isn't there, which indicates that that idea about the Grand Canyon's formation can't be right. Now, creation scientists today, on the other hand, believe that an ice age would have occurred after the flood that lasted for several hundred years due to the warmer oceans of the flood and therefore increased evaporation, the volcanic aerosols that would have been in the atmosphere that partially shielded the earth from sun rays, which then led to cooler summers and increased snowfall over the earth. The ice from that period is thought to have formed over an estimated 30% of the earth, and then as the earth gradually calmed down after the flood, that ice would have slowly melted, retreating back towards the poles and leaving huge icy lakes along the way. The secular geologists even acknowledge that happens during ice ages. Creationists believe at least 3 such lakes were left on the Colorado Plateau, and evidence of those ancient lakes supports that belief. Now, as would be predicted from the nature of these icy lakes, the natural dams that held the water probably would have breached. And one by one, like dominoes, they breached, released all this water, rapidly carving the Grand Canyon. Okay, someone says, now wait a minute, is there evidence that water can carve through rock like that? Yes, here's a couple very quick examples. Number one, in 1926, the Burlingame Canyon near Walla Walla, Washington. 30 meters deep, 500 meters long. This was carved in less than 6 days when engineers had to steer abnormally high amounts of water from a canal into Pine Creek. The Lake Missoula flood is a well-documented flood from, believe it or not, the Ice Age. Water breached this ice dam, 500 cubic miles of water. That is 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers in the world was released within 2 days. It destroyed 16,000 square miles of terrain. It cut hundreds of feet through solid rock. It created canyons like Dry Falls, which is 20 times the size of Niagara Falls. It created cliffs. It carved 50 cubic miles of earth. Number 3, this one was from Grand Canyon. This is carving that occurred due to the Colorado River, in fact. In June of 1983, there was heavy snowfall that caused the engineers to divert water from Glen Canyon into dam spillways. And there was so much water, so much velocity of this water that it caused chunks of 3-foot thick steel reinforced concrete to be torn out of this tunnel. It took tens of thousands of cubic feet of concrete to fill the gaping holes that were left. So bottom line, water has no problem cutting through rock if you've got enough of it and if it's moving fast enough, and that's exactly what we predict for these circumstances. The difference, of course, is accepting catastrophism, catastrophic events that can cause rapid geological features rather than the standard evolutionary dogma that believes in uniformitarianism. Everything happens slow and gradually. The other field trip I was able to go on to Wyoming for a few days. It was actually in the same area that I was in studying the seismites, but this time I got to study at the feet of who I would say is probably the leading dinosaur fossil expert among the young Earth creation geologists, Dr. Art Chadwick, and his team had excavated more than 18,000 dinosaur fossils from this single ranch where we're studying. There's a young Earth creationist lady that lets him go out there and excavate dinosaur fossils. Dwayne Bryan, who's an instructor, who was an instructor at Southwest School of Biblical Studies at the time and does some writing for us in the area of archaeology. He was able to come along with me, as well as one of our interns, Noah. Dr. Mike Houts, who's a nuclear engineer at NASA, a member of the church, who also does some writing for us, was able to drop by the site as well at the beginning of the week. Dr. Chadwick is a professor at a denominational university down in Texas, which again highlights the fact that the leaders in the field aren't members of the church. I think we need to fix that. He teaches geology courses, including a course on dinosaurs and creation, and each summer he brings students up to Wyoming for a month, and they camp out in tents at this site and excavate dinosaur fossils during the day and hear lectures on dinosaurs during the evening. And so we were able to come to this site during that time period for a few days to learn from Dr. Chadwick. And as with my trip to Wyoming in 2014 and 2016, we're working in the Cretaceous sediment there in the Lance Formation, just under the KT boundary. So again, we're back in the sediments that are thought to have been laid down at the end of the flood. And this is one of the primary spots in the world where you find Triceratops fossils. But you also find T-Rex and Nanotyrannus fossils, and you find the Pachycephalosaurus fossils there as well. And lots of Edmontosaurus. In fact, this is a maxillary of an Edmontosaurus, the upper jawbone that I excavated there while I was there in that June. Dwayne, Noah, and I were able to dig up several dinosaur fossils, teeth, lots of dinosaur tendons that are fossilized in that area, and so forth. All right, so of special interest to me both in these trips is especially, again, the last item on this list that I've already mentioned to you. We're trying to assess, can we get in the mix on this and start having creation fieldwork scientists that do this 24/7, do this kind of work, and can we do some of that work rather than just the little bits I'm getting to do really here and there. And so that's the big question that we're studying, though. The question that they're specifically answering at this site is the question everybody's asking: what happened to the dinosaurs? And that's the question the creationists are looking at there at this site. So on this ranch that we went to, Dr. Chadwick's overseeing this excavation again in what we would call flood sediment. And there are 5 different fossil quarries that are actively being excavated there. Dozens of dinosaur fossils are dug up and carefully documented every day while they're there over the summer. This picture on the left is one of those fossil quarries where you can see the fossils in the positions they were found with the dirt removed. And as you can see, we're talking thousands of fossils. This is the quarry I was working in. The excavation team documents the location of every fossil carefully using GPS. And they take pictures of each fossil and develop 3D representations of each of them, and then put them back into this picture based on the coordinates that they took, so that Dr. Chadwick can get a big picture of what happened to the dinosaurs here. And so there's actually depth to these pictures. We're just looking at kind of the bird's eye view, so some of these aren't on the exact same plane. There's depth to this. Here's another couple of the quarries. And so based on what's already been excavated over the last few years, and by making estimates over the area concerning what's left to be excavated, Dr. Chadwick believes there's over 15,000 dinosaurs that are represented in this area where he's already dug up over 18,000 fossils. Now, I don't know about you, but it seems to me that something pretty catastrophic happened to wipe these guys out and bury them rapidly where they could fossilize. Now, the standard secular explanation for what you find in this area says, well, okay, the dinosaurs died out gradually over time They were trying to cross a river during flood season. That wasn't a good idea. And so their corpses were washed down to this river bend where they just piled up over time. And they gradually got covered up there. Okay, so that's what you call a just so story. Okay, that's what they say. Now you got to get in the field to see if does the evidence fit that or not. You got to have somebody do that. So they say, hey, well, that would explain how this wasn't some global catastrophic process like the flood. It's just a local catastrophe, it's local flooding. All right, so you dig in and look at the actual evidence, and you find issues with that model. For one, the bones aren't oriented as you would expect in a river current. They're randomly oriented. So again, the thousands of bones that are being excavated by Dr. Chadwick and his team at this site are documented with multiple GPS points so that they can know exactly where the bones were found and their orientations. And they're finding that the bones are not found in a river current orientation. That's not what they're finding. Also, the bones aren't found piled as though they're in a river bend. No, they're randomly distributed over the entire area. So if you take the sites that he's excavated, which grows significantly each year, these areas, and you extrapolate to the areas that he hasn't yet gotten to, here's what you see. And also, these bones are disarticulated. That means the skeleton of the whole intact dinosaur isn't there. The bones are found separated. They're isolated from each other. Okay? Now, if corpses are piling up on a river bend, and in order to preserve the bones for fossilization, they have to be buried rapidly there before the scavengers get them, then you'd expect at least some of the remains to be articulated, the bones together as skeletons or partial skeletons. That's not what you have in these quarries. You have disarticulated bones. Also, if the dinosaur corpses were successively being piled up each year, what would you expect? Well, you'd expect there to be animals in layers, bone beds on top of each other, representing successive annual events. That's not what you find there. Instead, the dinosaur fossils in the area are in a single bed that's graded. That means the bigger bones are at the bottom, and then they get smaller as you go up, which indicates a single, rapid, catastrophic event that's responsible for the burial of 15,000 dinosaurs in this area. That's a pretty big event. Now, a model that fits the facts is a single catastrophic deep flood. It wipes out thousands and thousands of dinosaurs. It is so violent in this area of the world. Remember, this is where the seismites are found. You're seeing shock waves that if you were standing on the ground, it would obliterate you. These dinosaurs are being ripped apart. They're being just totally dismantled, and then in a huge mudslide, they're being dragged and dumped into this area in a single bed. That is not uniformitarianism. That is some kind of major global event that it fits the evidence. But again, keep in mind, you have to have people that get in the field to discover this, the great works of the Lord, and study them. Somebody's got to do that. And again, I suggest to you we need to be able to do that more often in the church. This event, the flood, would be capable of creating a single graded bone bed, just like we see these dinosaurs in. It'd be capable of creating the type and structure of the stone that we're finding the dinosaur fossils in, and it'd be capable of causing mudslides that would catastrophically bury some 15,000 dinosaurs and preserve them for fossilization. I'm hoping that you're finding that as exciting as I am. I think this stuff is neat. Looking at the positive evidence for the creation model, this is stuff that's fun to do, but it's more importantly, it's stuff that we need to do in order to be able to defend the biblical model and make the case for people. If you're going to pull them out of naturalism, you've got to be able to state the case for why the biblical model, it fits the evidence, it makes sense. So we'd appreciate your prayers for this endeavor that we're involved in, and appreciate your financial support as well as we continue to do that. Again, I've got free DVDs if there's any left of this session. Well, again, we want to offer the invitation to anybody that might not be a member of the church. You know, keep in mind what we have not done here in the session last night and the session where I'm talking about biomimicry, the session tomorrow. Most of the time when we talk about the existence of God, we're proving that a God exists. There's got to be something outside of the box. But we haven't proven which God exists by doing that. I was doing one of my evolution seminars down in it was Russellville, Arkansas Tech's there, and a lot of the whenever a congregation does a good job of really getting the word out and promoting these evolution seminars in particular, the biology students from any of the local universities love to show up and chew on me, and sometimes even the professors. That's always fun. I must taste good because they like to come chew on me. So anyway, a couple of the biology professors showed up and came up to me after one of the sessions, and there was one of them was one of these rabid atheistic type biology professors from the university there. Somebody from the congregation told me that she had taken his biology class in the past, and he's one of these guys that at the beginning of the class he asked the students, raise your hand if you believe in creation and you don't believe in evolution. A few sporadic hands go up, and he says, by the end of this class, I'm going to prove to you that you're wrong, you are silly, you're irrational. Evolution he's one of these type guys that really puts you on the spot. So he comes up and asks, well, let's say you're right. Let's say there is a God. You haven't proven which God exists. How do you know which God exists? How come it couldn't be another supernatural entity? How come it couldn't be Allah or Buddha? How come it couldn't be the Wiccan religion? How come it couldn't be the flying spaghetti monster? Yeah, the flying spaghetti monster is the atheists have kind of made an organization called the Pastafarians in order to kind of make fun of Christianity, because they think there's just as much evidence for a creature we could make up, the flying spaghetti monster, as there is for the God of the Bible. It says, how do you know which God exists? You haven't proven that. All right, so you got to be able, look, you don't have a blind faith. God does not want you to have a blind faith. You have to be able to know. How can you know specifically that the God of the Bible exists? Somebody says, well, because the Bible says. Well, so does the Book of Mormon. Okay, and so does the Quran. It says Allah wrote it. That's not sufficient proof. That's necessary. It's not sufficient. How do you know that the God of the Bible is specifically the God that exists? And so I said, well, the answer to that is that we have positive evidence specifically for the God of the Bible. He said, oh yeah, okay, I want to hear this. What is this? I said, we have a book that has characteristics that humans could not have produced. Divine characteristics. And he sat there with his mouth open. A little drool coming out. He sat there for probably 6 seconds. And then he goes, really? Let's see, now what concerned me about this, clearly, Christendom has not been answering this question for this guy. He thought this was a stump him kind of question. But we got to have, this is the most fundamental question here. How can you know the God of the Bible exists? Not just a God, but specifically the God of the Bible. We have a book with divine characteristics that humans could not have produced. It has to come from a higher being that created this. So he goes, really? I said, yeah, we don't have a blind faith in the God of the Bible. He sat there again. He goes, I'd like to see that. Let me tell you, that was one of the most exciting moments in all my time at AP. It is so rare to get to a point where you make a point to one of these guys and they come back with, I want to see the evidence you're talking about for the God of the Bible. The Bible has these many characteristics that prove it's beyond human capability. We got a book on the subject. I told him, well, I've got a book on this. This is what we do at Apologetics Press. I've got a book that addresses that for you. It's called Behold the Word of God. And he said, well, I'd like to see that. And he said, I want to pay for it because I don't want to support you guys, but I'd like to see what you're talking about. One of the elders quickly jumped up, bought him that book. He walked away. I don't know what he did with it. I haven't heard from him since. But he had the line was drawn in the sand for this guy. There is evidence to know specifically it's the God of the Bible that exists. And then it's just a matter of choosing to believe it. Choose to believe the evidence. God expects you to do that. Believe the evidence. God exists. The Bible is His Word, and therefore you can know that Jesus is the Son of God. And then you got to turn from your sins in repentance, confess Christ verbally with your mouth, Romans 10:9 and 10, and then be immersed in water for the remission of your sins. If that's something you'd like to do tonight, we encourage you to not delay. Come forward now while we stand and sing.